this is just amazing. Thank you, John. Thank you, Liana. This is to see so many people that honestly were under the age of 30 when I first met them. And now they're all grown up and they've done all these amazing things. And it's really wonderful. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Donna Culpepper. I was the CEP president from 1996 until 2002. And I had spent most of my life as a career Foreign Service officer with the U.S. Information Agency. I had worked on exchange programs, cultural programs, academic programs. So I had some background, but as you probably know, the US government is an enormous bureaucracy. So when I came to CEP, I remember saying to Nandini and Phil after we had a meeting, I can't believe we just spent a half an hour, made 10 decisions, and we can go out and act on them. Because in the US government, it would have taken months to do that. So one of the things that I learned immediately upon joining CEP was how easy it was to work with a flexible organization. And with the kind of organization that we had, you had to be flexible. You had to be able to go to the Baltics in 48 hours. You had to take over from somebody else when they got sick. You had to put out fires in one of your countries. You had to take care of a sick visiting lecturer. There were all kinds of things that people had to do. And everybody did it, everybody came up and it was just a wonderful group of people to work with. And Liana, you're absolutely right. I think the network that was created through CEP is one of those kinds of networks that will never really go away. I think we all have benefited from it and we all continue to benefit from it. And I hope that everybody who was connected with CEP and who's still younger than I am will continue to work and keep the network alive. So while I was an administrator, I was not a founder, and the organization was founded by some, again, very young, flexible people, Steve Grand, Ann Clunan, and Bill Antholis were, I believe, graduate students or recent graduates of universities, and they had the inspirational idea to start a program overseas. And today they're going to talk about the influences that brought them to that point. Steve, I wonder if you could begin by telling us, what was it in the world, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the change of system that inspired you to do this, and why did you start with Czechoslovakia?
Thanks, Donna. And wow, it's just so amazing to be with everyone here. As Brian said, as he alluded to, when you drop a stone in the water, you don't know what the ripple effects will be, right? And it's just wonderful to see all these ripple effects. It's really moving. Thank you to John Becker and to Bard for hosting this. This is just incredible. I will, per Donna's question, just give maybe 4 vignettes about that initial founding year of CEP. And in that way, it will also, I think, give some context and introduce the other founders and the other people who are a part of this story, the founding story. I was in Prague in the summer of 1990 because I was a graduate student, and as any good graduate student, or maybe not quite so good graduate student does, I was looking for a dissertation topic, and I because of that was talking to a number of professors and intellectuals in Prague. It was a magical time in Prague because the country had just had its Velvet Revolution 6 months earlier. This was the first summer, and everyone from the West wanted to be in Prague, and everyone in Prague wanted to meet someone from the other parts of the world. And it was just a very exciting time. And as I talked to a number of professors, some of them were new heads of political science departments, new heads of economics departments, and were charged with sort of restructuring what clearly had been departments of Marxism, Leninism into modern social science departments. And they were all a little intrigued to find a Western trained social scientist in their midst. They were excited. And a couple of them asked it separately in separate conversations, would you come teach at the university next year? And I said, no, I have agreed with my then fiance, Paige Alexander, who's now my wife. We've agreed that we're going to spend a year in Prague. So I have a year to do my research. I can't possibly teach. The time frame's too short. And so I then reached out to Bill Antholis. Bill and I had gone to UVA together, were and remain very, very close friends. We were so close in undergraduate at UVA that we had applied to get a special exception so we could write our senior thesis together, which we did. So I reached out to Bill, who was at that point a graduate student at Yale in political science, and asked him if he would come teach, because I figured if I couldn't do it, he was an even better substitute. And Bill also was on a tight timeline. He wanted to get his dissertation finished, and I'll let him tell more of the story. But he said, "Yeah, I can't possibly. I got to write the dissertation this year." But we happened to be meeting up in Budapest that summer, and so we talked then and also in between by phone about this, and realized there was this incredible need. It also happened to come at a time when the teaching market for academics in the United States was horrible. It's often horrible, but it was particularly horrible at that time. And what more would young graduate students, young PhDs want to do at that moment than to go to Eastern Europe or the former Soviet Union? It was definitely the flavor of the month, and something that everyone wanted to do. So it was really out of those chance encounters and chance conversations that the whole thing got started. I agreed to approach Harvard, which is where I was doing my dissertation, and Bill Yale to see if they might have interest. And we went on from there. The second vignette is I'm back in the States that fall of 1990, and I'm about to go back for a full year of research. And I realized I have basically 6 weeks to turn this crazy idea into something concrete. And it just seems incredibly quixotic. And I'm sitting there in my fiance's apartment in Washington, D.C. with a phone book. And I'm literally going through the phone book and trying to figure out who I can call who might be able to be helpful. And I call Charles Vanek, who had been a member of Congress, who was of Czech descent, and talked to him. I called a number of foundations, and I had a couple of charming conversations, but I was getting absolutely nowhere. And someone, I don't remember who it was, says, you need to talk to Wendy Luers. And Wendy at the time was setting up something called the Charter 77 Foundation, which grew out of the Charter 77 movement. It had supported the original foundation in Stockholm. It supported the dissidents before the fall of the wall. And so Wendy was setting up a Charter 77 Foundation in New York and in Prague. And so I ended up finally getting her on the phone, and we had this wonderful conversation. And she said, can you come to New York? Let's talk. So I went to New York, and Wendy and I sat down, and we had a long, long conversation. And she said, I love this idea. I want to fund it. And you have to know Wendy a little to realize she was not going to take out her paycheck, take out her checkbook. But she said generously, you have to come back next week, and I'm going to introduce you to George Soros, which was really the pivotal moment that turned this from a graduate student's fanciful idea to a reality. So Bill Antholis and I flew up to New York the following week. I think it was like literally like a day or 2 days before I was scheduled to fly back to then Czechoslovakia. And we went to this office building, the very top floor, this conference room that was just enormous. For a 25-year-old, it was the biggest thing I'd ever seen. And at one end of the conference room was these incredible windows that looked out on Central Park, and the sun was sort of setting, so the sun was coming into Bill and my eyes in this huge conference room. And we were as I remember, we were sort of at one end of the conference room, and George Soros was at the other. But all we could see was this sort of silhouette of this very big man because of the sun, and it was incredibly intimidating. And George Soros heard us out, and he said, "This is never going to work." He said, "This is never going to work," because he knew Central and East European universities fairly well from his early philanthropic support. He was just getting started with his philanthropy, but he'd given a lot in the 80s to dissidents and to scholars. He said, "The bureaucracy is just going to kill this. There's just no way you're going to be able to do it. But I'll give you," and I think it was $20,000 to get started. And that's really all we needed to get this thing off the ground. Meanwhile, Harvard said, this is sort of a lesson for those who are in university administration. Harvard came back and said, "This is very interesting, but we're really busy. We've got a lot of things going on right now with regard to Central and Eastern Europe. Maybe we can revisit this in a year." And in the meantime, Bill had gone to Yale, and I'll let him tell the story, and they were very receptive. And so that's sort of why it ended up at Yale, and Bill will share more on that. The third vignette is I then spent the rest of the academic year on trains going back and forth to various universities, to all the universities in Czechoslovakia. And it's important to point out at that point, our vision of this thing was just for Czechoslovakia, or what later became the Czech Republic and Slovakia. We, imagined 15, maybe 30 lectures in Czechoslovakia, and that was the extent of our ambitions. And I went, in many cases, 4 and 5 times to these universities to finally be able to get the agreements that allowed us to bring the first 15 lecturers over. A dirty secret that the country directors know, but maybe those who are lecturers don't, is it was just impossible back in those days to get the kinds of agreements that would allow all of you to come teach. Really, really hard. People, newly empowered rectors and deans were very reluctant about putting their signature on anything. There were still a lot of what the Czechs called stare struktury, old structures at the universities who were dead set against having Westerners in their universities. We required, as part of the contract, of course, that they provide housing, your office space, a salary equivalent to what they pay a similar local colleague, and all that no one knew how to do because it had never been done before. And so I think it was the hardest job of my life, and I salute those who did it for many, many years and were able to make all this work, because wow, that was hard. And along the way, Madeleine Albright, when I had been in Washington, who was not quite yet then Madeleine Albright, of great fame, had suggested that I meet this former student of hers, Anne Clunan, who was running an English teaching organization that Georgetown students had set up in Prague. So during that year, I also went and met Anne in her office, and was very impressed. I'll let her tell that part of the story, but she ended up being the first full-time paid staff of the university, and went on to really run the operations in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet space as well. The last vignette that I'll leave you with is 10 days before the lectures were set to arrive in Czechoslovakia. There was the coup in Moscow. This was August of 1990. So you can imagine those first 15 lecturers who were scheduled to come to Czechoslovakia were a little nervous, and their parents were a little nervous. And there's a lot of sort of communication back and forth between the Yale office and the Prague office to what this all meant. And sitting in the Prague office, you could see people, Czechs, peering out the windows, just wondering if the Russian tanks were going to roll back in. So it was a very inauspicious moment for us to be bringing lecturers over. And I remember staying up late a couple of those nights, just completely worried. And it kind of dawned on me just what an unusual and unprecedented experiment this was. How would Czech and Slovak students react to these young lecturers coming from Western Europe and the United States? How would they react to, Locke and Rousseau, as opposed to what the Marx and Lenin that they'd gotten in school for their childhood? And of course, all of that was a false fear. Students warmly welcome these young Western trained lecturers. They warmly welcome the new teaching material. But what was really novel, and I think everyone will be able to relate to this, was just the style of teaching. You had these young lecturers coming who did not teach in a hierarchical way, did not sort of stand at a podium and tell students what they needed to know, but actually were asking questions. And many students early on were reporting, I've never been asked my opinion before. And I think that was what was revolutionary about what we were doing. The encouraging of critical thinking, the Socratic method, the asking of questions. I think all this was part of the magic of CEP. Sometime that summer, even before the Czech and Slovak lecturers arrived, Soros became very warm on the idea of the Civic Education Project. And even before we sort of proved the concept in Czechoslovakia, he was urging us to begin setting up programs in Poland, Hungary, and the Baltic states. And I'll let others sort of take the story from there, but I just say this to point out that we weren't really set up for that. And all that followed and that Donna had to clean up and Ann had to clean up was because that was far beyond our original vision in so many ways. And it was very much a grad student run organization at the very beginning. But I'll turn it over now to my colleagues, without whom I can confidently say we would not be here today, because I was the crazy one who came up with this crazy idea, but I was fortunate to have colleagues capable of actually making it happen. And thanks to all those on the panel who did make this happen.
So thank you, Steve. I think over the years, we still did not always have the agreements with the universities, and we brought foreign lecturers in and we told them, yes, indeed, you will have an apartment, but that wasn't always the case when they first arrived. So it continued to be a flexible organization. There are a lot of logistics involved in an organization like CEP and setting up a program like that. And I think Bill can address some of those because he was faced with some of the very first problems. Can you take it from where Steve left off?
Sure. Well, first, thanks for including me. It's so great to see both people who I haven't seen in a while, people who were so important in the creation of this and were and are important in my life. And then to see faces with names that I would keep hearing about over the years, but I'm not sure I ever met. And this is just really very special to see all of you. I'll start the origin story a little bit earlier. I first met Steve in the basement of a dormitory at UVA where we were DJs together, WUVA. It's only important to tell that story because it started a friendship that involved at least one stop before then. We worked on political campaigns together, first the Dukakis campaign, and probably a few others before CEP got started. But the thing that we did was we were advanced people. We were basically logisticians on moving people around. Airplanes, cars, hotel rooms. And that ended up being a big part of this story because we had to figure out how to get people from point A to point B. And we were coached and mentored by people who did this professionally for presidents and presidential candidates. So when I think about and hear from you all the impact that CEP has had on you and through you so many other people, I think about the impact that people who taught us how to do some what were very basic skills that have really served us in life, including, I remember the first recruiting trip that I did to recruit the first class. I basically took a train from New Haven as far south as I could take it and as far north as I could take it on the East Coast, and just stopped at every good university along the way. On the way down, I put up flyers, and on the way back, I met with people who had seen the flyers. And that's how we really recruited the first class. Did the same out in California, where I had a few friends both at UCLA and up north, and posted in a few places on the West Coast, stayed in a pretty seedy hotel in Santa Monica and did interviews, and then took a weekend trip to Vegas with my 75-year-old uncle and played blackjack for the weekend and made my money to fly home to New Haven from there. The other great things that I learned was this part about negotiating with the universities there, which Steve had to do, and I got to accompany him on the first trip, where I think my complimentary memory of Steve from the first meeting with Soros was him basically admonishing us, don't give this to the universities for free. Make sure they have skin in the game. I think that suggestion came from George. If it didn't, it came from somebody really smart. It was the hardest part, but maybe the most important part of what you all did on the ground there. And I'm telling you what you already know, but we didn't know that, or at least I didn't know that. And then my job was with traveling with Steve was to make sure it was good enough. Like, was an apartment the kind of apartment a student would another grad student would want to live in over there? Were people going to be as selfless as Steve Grand in terms of what they were willing to put up with on the ground? And so I was a little bit of a, not naysayer, but sort of quality control. But it was amazing to see what they actually did do, and made me really feel bad that I didn't take up the offer to go do it myself. There were all these other people that were involved in the first year or two. I mean, it's so great to see Jonathan Stein, who I spent a lot of time in grad school with, but people like Rogan Kirsch and Maria Elena, I'm quick blanking on her last name, Aguro, Angulo, who helped do the first selection and then the second selection. And that goes back to my second Soros memory. Steve, what I remember, and maybe Wendy can confirm this, I think we got about $100,000 or $150,000 for the first year, which was enough to pay people basically $1,000 a month stipend, their travel expenses, I think 12 or 14 lecturers, whatever we had, plus some of our expenses. So maybe it was 150, maybe 175. But when Soros gave it to us, he said, I'm only giving this to you if you commit to 80 students next year in the following countries. And he rattled off Bulgaria, Poland, Ukraine. Like, I think we ended up getting 4 of the 5 countries he suggested. I can't remember which one we didn't get. But basically, he gave us a challenge grant. He said, I'm going to do this, but only if you get to scale. Because if you do it only in Czechoslovakia, it won't have the... I think he was really impressed that we went out and got the initial set of commitments from the universities. And the other thing, which you all know if you were in the field, but at the time we didn't know, was, I think Steve identified this, the target of opportunity were the universities outside the main cities. Everybody wanted to be in Prague. Everybody wanted to be at Charles University. That was going to be your biggest hurdle. Go to places that I'd never heard of before, Olomouc, or, you know, those were the places. I think I was close to signing up myself to go to Varna, in Bulgaria for a year or two, and then I ended up deciding not to. And then finally, the last bit of this that's just so inspiring to me is the personal stories, the marriages that came of this, the children that came of this. I don't really want to know about the divorces that came of this, but it's so inspiring to me to see that we didn't just have the kind of impact we were thinking about. We had the kind of impact that ends up being really important, like we shaped people's lives because we created a network, and that network connected people that had similar interests and passions. And for me, that's the most exciting thing about the professional lives that we choose, is they end up having this other dimension. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Bill. I see our West Coast contingent has joined us. Nice to see you, Les. Les Francis was a longtime board member for CEP, and Anne Clunan, who was the one of the founders and was, I guess, the last of the board chairs when CEP was finally dissolved. Anne, tell us something about your experience.
Well, it's so hard to choose. So since we're thinking about origins, I think I'll start there. But I want to say that I never would have met Steve and Bill if it hadn't been for Wendy Luers. So I want to give a shout out to Wendy. The first organization that I was trying to set up had some similar problems in terms of getting agreements from, in this case, high schools and the Ministry of Education. And the whole thing was about to collapse. And Wendy, I met Wendy through the State Department, and she sent me on an airplane to go fix it. And as a result, I ended up in Czechoslovakia, right from the start, and got to see sort of the transition as it was happening, to, sort of a attempt at trying to unpack all of the communist legacy and move forward. And I think one of my favorite stories from this period was that Steve Grants shows up in my office, which was in a building of the Ministry of Education in Prague, and says, Madeleine Albright sent me to see you, and I really need, there were three things, and I can't remember the third, but one of them, I really need to find an apartment so that my fiance can come over. And I really need to find a laundromat, which, as you may remember, in those days was actually quite difficult. So the initial logistics of getting, and I think this is one of the things the country directors will remember perhaps with a groan. One of the most difficult things was not just the human logistics, but also the books, and sort of the challenge of getting all of the textbooks distributed to the right place at the right times in conditions that were all pre-internet, and it was just a massive challenge. And the first year in Czechoslovakia was, it was going really well. And my memory of a meeting with Soros was for the second year's budget. And Steve and I were, I think, meeting him in Prague, and, Steve asked me to put together a budget, and I put together a budget for, I think, $57,000 to, run the program in Czechoslovakia. And Soros came back and said, okay, I'm going to give you $1.3 million, and you're going to go expand to 9 countries. And so that was this sort of moment where I guess we had sort of demonstrated sufficiently to him that we could do this. And Steve went out and started recruiting country directors in all of these new countries. They ended up being 10 because of the Velvet divorce. And some of them were pretty quirky, and some of them were really interesting, fascinating people, and some of them are here with us today. And so that experience of constantly traveling, this was an effort that we never could have achieved without the support of OSI in the Soros Foundations in those early days, because they were the ones who were meeting us on the ground and being our interlocutors and helping us set up all of these contacts at universities and things like that. In terms of the way in which the program expanded, it just exploded. And that caused a whole bunch of issues on its own, because we couldn't give the sort of attention and detail to just one country at a time, and all of the endless problems that were coming up in terms of, the universities reneging on particular parts of the commitments. And so my job was not only to go out and sort of try to encourage rectors to, allow our students to come, or rather our lecturers to come to their countries and universities. It was also to put out a lot of fires. And I still remember, from the first meeting I had in Ukraine, while we were setting up that program, Steve, you reminded me of this with that long conference room. It was not in a shiny high tower. It was in a very old university in Kyiv. And they had assembled every single rector from every single university in Ukraine. And I just want to remind everyone at this point that I was 22. I had an undergraduate degree. I was not a doctoral student. And, it was so intimidating to stand there in front of all these gray-haired men, and they were all men, and sort of pitch to them what we were trying to do. And yet somehow it caught on. And I think that experience of, sort of showing what can happen in these critical junctures of history was the most important thing to me. Later on in the organization's history, we were being called to provide metrics of success. And this is, I'm sitting now not far from Silicon Valley. This is how all the tech foundations work. They want very clear metrics that they're having an impact. And yet what we did was almost immeasurable. It was both very difficult to measure, but it also had this generational effect that we heard from the first panel. And that, I think, is one of the biggest legacies for me. One of my favorite memories from 2004 was watching the Orange Revolution in Ukraine and saying, those are CEP students on the streets. Those are the people that we've inspired to fight for what they think is right. And that kind of legacy, I think, is to me, one of the most important things that we were able to do. And I don't think that any of us had a full concept of what that would mean at the time. But the fact that, this organization developed in this really ground up way in terms of going to the universities, asking them what they wanted, not providing a template. For me, that was the most important part of it, because it was an organic organization that was growing from the ground up. And I think that's why we succeeded for so long, where others didn't. When I got to Prague, or here's another favorite story. Steve and I had gone to Brasov in Romania, and we were waiting to meet the rector of the university. And, while we're waiting in the anteroom, then two gentlemen come out from George Mason University, and they were public choice theorists who had come to tell the university that they needed to adopt public choice economics as the curriculum sort of, structure. And it was totally antithetical to both the philosophy of CEP and to what, in my view, I thought the countries needed, which was exactly the pluralism that we were offering. And instead, many Westerners came over saying, here's the template, here's the ideology to replace Marxism, Leninism. But what we came with was, here are the ways in which you can teach yourselves how we teach ourselves, the critical thinking skills, the thinking outside the box, the challenging, efforts to criticize existing theories and push forward in a pedagogic manner, something that was really profoundly revolutionary. So for me, those are the most important aspects of what we did. I never could have imagined that we would have ended up in, I think, 26 countries if we include Kosovo as a country. And, by the end, it was a very complex organization, but it never lost that bottom-up, need-based characteristic, which I think is what makes it probably unique in these kinds of organizations. So I'll stop there for now.
Okay, thank you.
Wendy has her hand up.
Yes, I want to call on Wendy. Wendy, you have been pivotal in getting CEP off the ground and keeping it going. We'd love to hear from you. What do you want to share with us?
Well, I mean, mine are so trivial compared to the weight of 26 countries finally and all the rest of it, but they're incredible memories. I had set up an office in New York and in Prague called Charter 77, which later became the Foundation for a Civil Society. And I was the only non-Soros foundation inside of Soros with office space in Soros's in George's place, because he gave me after a meeting at the Ford Foundation in January, when Bill and I came back from giving Václav Havel's inaugural dinner and attending, and being at his inauguration, where Olga wore my blouse and Václav wore Bill's tie. So you can imagine, because my husband was the American ambassador from 83 to 86, and we had befriended them, that we had the trust of the new government of Czechoslovakia, and everybody asked for a point of contact. And I became that point of contact. I had absolutely no idea how to start an NGO, but I'd been working for Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, and had been a journalist, and we knew Czechoslovakia very, very well. So these two guys come wandering into the office, and I thought it was an incredibly smart idea. I didn't know what ABD meant at that point, because I had only been an undergraduate at Stanford. But it was everything was seat of the pants at that point. I mean, and so Steve and Paige were going over, and Paige wanted a job too. So the Rockefeller Brothers Fund gave me a grant to pay her to see what was happening with the NGO sector in Czechoslovakia at that point. But you all went to these countries just as these things were emerging, and it was just the same way in Czechoslovakia, even though Prague is a very sophisticated city. The ladies who were the telephone operators at Charles University, if they heard an English coming through their ears, they would pull the plug, because they were afraid that they were going to lose their jobs if all these Westerners came in and disrupted their system. Second of all, nobody spoke English. And so what we did in the very beginning was with Steve, was to set up English language courses for the students who were at Charles University, who were going to be learning and hearing from these non-Czech speaking lecturers who were coming in. And back to what Anne was talking about, and the idea of Georgetown and Madeleine Albright. My daughter was at Georgetown, if you remember, Anne. It was Ramsey Turnbull, and she was one of the early people that helped to organize the Georgetown students who were coming to teach English. We organized the Masaryk Fellows, and the Masaryk Fellows ended up being over 500 young undergraduates, usually, who came over paying their own ticket, and we placed them with Czech and Slovak families. And they taught English, and they had no books, 0 books. And there was only one Xerox machine in the country. And so they would come over with Time magazines and Newsweeks and things. And I'd say, well, what do you talk to them about for 4 hours in the morning? Because the Charles University people and Lisa Shvedova set up all of the classrooms, and it was absolutely the Wild West. I mean, everybody was just doing this from the seat of their pants. And when I said, I said to my goddaughter, Kelsey Worth, Senator Worth's daughter, I said, Kelsey, what do you talk to them about? And she said, oh, the death penalty, abortion, whatever interests me is what I talk to them about. Well, those 500 plus Masrick fellows are like the people that you all taught in countries all over the world, in all over the former communist world. They are now, unfortunately, we weren't organized enough to keep track of them the way you all kept track of them, of the CEP lecturers, but they are still fans of Czechoslovakia or the Czech Republic and Slovakia. It was inspiring, I must say, to go to Yale and listen to the stories that people were telling as they came back from countries that were much more complicated and much more difficult than Czechoslovakia or the Czech Republic and Slovakia. But that's where it started. And it was a great idea. And having been inside the Soros operation without being a Soros foundation, so I wasn't afraid of George for about 4 years. It was, it was watching George say, I'll give you $1.2 million tomorrow morning if you want it. And that was the I guess that was the banner, right, Bill and Steve, that we said, well, let's just go do it. All they can do is say no, right? And so off we went. And so chapeau to all of you. And Donna, it's great to see you all, and it was great to see all of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Wendy, very much. So when I was in Budapest with the US government, I had never heard of CEP. And one day I met a young man in Budapest, Kerry McNamara, who said, have you ever heard of CEP? I want to tell you about it. And he took me to a reception and introduced me to some of the members of the Open Society Institute and persuaded me to think about joining CEP. Kerry, would you tell us what your role was in these first years of CEP and how that influenced you and the organization? Kerry McNamara. I thought I saw him there.
Sorry. Yeah, hi. So thanks, Donna. And wait, let me start the video. All right. Okay, here I am. Sorry. Thanks, Donna. Great to see you. Great to see you all. I consider myself a little more than a modest footnote in this whole story, but I had the great opportunity to become executive director of CEP right several months after the Big Bang. In other words, right when the programs beyond the Czechoslovak Republic had just been kicked off. And, as Anne said, there was, it was a lot of pressure to get a lot bigger very fast. Fortunately, we were able to recruit a number of really excellent and wonderful country directors and core staff. And I, for a couple of years then, sort of lived in Frankfurt Airport, traveled around a lot. It was an incredible privilege and opportunity. I still cherish the memory of it. I had actually, it was sort of accidental that I ended up associated with CEP in the sense that I was a fellow at the Kennedy School, and I was doing a little work with a project there led by Baroness Shirley Williams, which was called Project Liberty, which was about training policymakers and public officials in the newly democratized countries on, sort of democratic policymaking and governance. And one of the key people on the staff of Project Liberty was Paige Alexander, who I had the great pleasure of meeting, and she introduced me to Steve, and that led to some conversations. I was supposed to be finishing my dissertation, but was distractible. And I had already, my dissertation was on a subject related to the region, and dissertation that I never finished. And I had previously worked at a place in New York called the East-West Institute. So anyway, I jumped at the opportunity and had the incredible privilege of leading CEP for about 3 years of that major growth spurt. and always remember it as one of the most challenging but wonderful things I've done in my career, and just really lovely to be with you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Kerry. Our time is just about up, but I want to recognize and call on Les Francis, if he wouldn't mind. Les was a very active board member and was one of the founding board members of CEP, and he played a very important role in supporting all of our work overseas. Les?
Thank you, Donna. First of all, let me just say hi to people like you and Wendy and Kerry and Steve and Bill and Ann, and it's great to see all of you and to be reminded of our dear friend and colleague Madeline Albright, whose our lives intersected with in many different ways over the years. Just two quick things. I'm as Steve and Bill know painfully, and Donna too, I am not an academic. I'm a political hack, and that's how I got to know Steve and then Bill. Steve worked with me in the 1984 Mondale campaign. We all remember the next former president of the United States, Walter Mondale. But and then I got Steve involved with some work I was doing through NDI in Northern Ireland, and the NDI connection here is important to me, at least. And that was I was doing work with NDI, largely with Madeline, in the former Soviet bloc countries, 89, 90, 91, trying to figure out how to sustain democracy. At the same time, Bill and Steve came to me. I think I may have been at the DCCC at that time. I don't recall if it was, yeah. And they came to me with this, at that time, evolving idea, just to do a gut check with me whether I thought it made any sense, and from an organizational standpoint. And I said, I think it's great. I think it's timely. I think you should do it. And they said, great. How'd you like to be on our board? You know, a very artful way of recruiting somebody. So I agreed, and one of the task I ended up when Kerry decided to move on and get back to his graduate work was to secure a new CEO, and Donna was the one who came highly recommended, and I was, I guess, chair of the search committee, which is not quite accurate because there was no search. It was for me to fly to Budapest and spend time with Donna and see if I could interest her in the CEO position, which I managed to do. So I have great pride in the work that we did, but even more pride in the work that all of you did in country and you know, trying to sustain democratic development. It's and as this idea for a reunion or you know, recollections came up, you know, there are lessons to be learned, and I would just draw to one of them is that we can never stop. It's not automatic. Democracy is not what we think that it's sort of an automatic development in the minds and hearts of people. It has to be nurtured and pushed and sustained, not just in Eastern Europe, but I'd suggest even here. So it's great to be with you. It's great to see. So Wendy, I haven't seen you in years. It's wonderful to see you and the other guys, and Steve and Bill, who got me involved with CEP in the first place. I can't thank you enough. So
Okay. Thank you, Les. I think our hour is finished, and the next hour will begin when Jonathan is ready, and it will be led by Sasha Stokovich, who was one of the first country director. Well, he wasn't a country director. He was an Eastern Scholar when I first met him, and he became a country director. So